Rain hammered the glass roof of the old greenhouse as Alina Whitmore pressed herself against a wall of ferns, heart pounding, certain someone was watching her from the dark rows of orchids. She had arrived at Ashford Hall only that morning, hired to sketch and catalog the estate's rare plants before a private auction stripped the gardens bare. The letter promised quick payment, and she needed it badly. Her studio rent was due, her savings were gone, and this commission was the only thing standing between her and failure. She had not expected the grounds to feel so alive, so watched, so strange. A figure stepped out from behind a trellis of climbing roses, and she gasped before she could stop herself. He was tall, with soil on his hands and sleeves rolled to the elbow, a pair of pruning shears hanging loosely from his fingers. "You must be the illustrator," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "I'm Nathaniel. I look after the gardens here." Alina exhaled, embarrassed by her own fright. "Sorry, I didn't expect anyone else to be out in this weather." "Rain is good for roses," he said simply. "Bad for nerves, it seems." She laughed despite herself, and something about his easy manner settled the tension in her chest. He offered to show her around before the storm worsened, and she accepted, grateful for a guide who clearly knew every hidden path and rare specimen on the property. As they walked beneath dripping trees, he named plants she had only read about in books, correcting her sketches with a knowledge that seemed far too deep for a man who called himself a gardener. "You know a lot for someone who just prunes hedges," she said, only half joking. "I've had a long time to learn," he answered, and something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. By the time they reached the walled garden, the rain had softened to a drizzle, and Alina found herself relaxed for the first time in days. She noticed, briefly, how the household staff who passed them on the gravel path lowered their eyes and murmured greetings that seemed oddly formal for a gardener's companion. She assumed it was simply politeness, the quiet manners of an old estate, and thought nothing more of it. Nathaniel walked her back toward the guest cottage as evening fell, promising to meet her again the next morning to help her find the estate's rarest orchid, hidden deep in the eastern hothouse. Alina thanked him, already looking forward to it, already trusting him in a way she rarely trusted strangers. What she did not know, what he had no intention yet of telling her, was that the garden she had come to sketch, the hall behind her, and every hedge and flower bed for miles belonged entirely to him. He had let her believe the simplest lie without saying a single false word, and as he turned back toward the house alone, he found he was in no hurry at all to correct her. The eastern hothouse smelled of warm soil and something sweet, and Alina found the rare orchid exactly where Nathaniel promised it would be, glowing pale purple under the morning light. She sketched quickly, aware of him watching from a few feet away, his presence somehow both distracting and comforting. Over the following days, their meetings became a habit neither of them questioned. He showed her forgotten corners of the estate, a stone bridge swallowed by ivy, a maze planted a century ago, a pond where old carp drifted beneath lily pads. Each place came with a story, and she began to notice that his stories were never about a distant employer, but about a family, his family, spoken of with a strange, guarded affection. She told herself it was simply the way old estates worked, servants who had grown close to the histories they maintained. She did not question why the housekeeper addressed him so carefully, or why the groundskeeper stepped aside when he passed. Her mind was too full of him, of the low sound of his laughter, of the way he remembered small details she mentioned only once. One afternoon, while sketching in the greenhouse, she confessed more than she meant to. She told him about her father's illness, about the debts piling up at home, about how this commission might be her last real chance to prove herself as an illustrator. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and later that evening, without her knowledge, he made a single phone call that extended her contract by 2 full months and doubled her fee. He told the estate's manager to say nothing about where the decision came from. Alina noticed only that her employer had suddenly become generous, and she assumed some distant lord had simply taken a liking to her work. She thanked her good fortune and kept sketching, kept spending her afternoons beside a man she believed earned his living with dirt beneath his fingernails. Their closeness deepened in ways neither of them planned. A sudden storm caught them both in the greenhouse one evening, thunder rattling the glass panes, rain turning the world outside into a gray blur. Elena, laughing at the chaos of it, turned to find Nathaniel closer than she expected, his eyes steady on hers, something unspoken passing between them. Neither moved for a long moment. Neither spoke. The moment broke when lightning flashed, and they both stepped back, flustered, pretending the closeness had not happened. That night, lying awake in the guest cottage, Elena found herself thinking not about orchids or deadlines, but about a gardener who somehow felt like far more than what he claimed to be. She told herself she was imagining things, that loneliness and long hours were playing tricks on her heart, but some quiet part of her refused to believe the lie, even as she could not yet name the truth hiding just beneath it. Weeks passed, and Elena's sketchbook filled with drawings of rare blossoms, but the pages meant less to her than the hours spent walking beside Nathaniel through fields of lavender and old stone paths. She began to admit to herself, quietly, that she had fallen for him, not for any comfort or promise, but for the simple way he made ordinary afternoons feel important. He, too, found himself changed. For years he had been surrounded by people who wanted his name, his fortune, his title, and here was a woman who wanted nothing but his company, who laughed at his jokes and challenged his opinions without a trace of flattery. He knew the lie had gone too far to end simply. Each day he did not correct her made the truth harder to speak. He told himself he would explain everything soon, after the auction, after her contract ended, after one more quiet week together. He was not cruel, only afraid, caught in a comfort he had never known and was unwilling to lose. Elena, unaware of the storm gathering behind his silence, grew bolder in her feelings. One evening, as they sat together on the stone bridge watching the sun sink behind the hills, she admitted softly that she had never expected to feel this way about anyone, let alone a gardener she had met by accident. Nathaniel's chest tightened at her words, guilt and longing colliding inside him. He wanted to tell her everything, wanted to watch her expression shift from confusion to understanding, but the words caught in his throat, and instead he simply took her hand, and for a moment nothing else mattered. Word of their closeness reached the household staff, who exchanged worried glances but said nothing, bound by loyalty to a master who had asked for silence. The estate's old housekeeper, a woman named Margaret who had served the family for decades, warned Nathaniel privately that secrets like this rarely stayed buried, that the longer he waited, the harder the fall would be. He brushed off her concern, certain he still had time. But time, as it often does, ran out sooner than expected. An invitation arrived for a formal dinner at the hall, meant to celebrate the completion of Elena's illustrations before the auction. She assumed it was a simple gathering of staff, and perhaps a distant relative of the owner. She spent the afternoon preparing, nervous but excited, unaware that the evening would strip away every assumption she had built her heart around. As she dressed in the guest cottage, Nathaniel stood alone in his private study, staring at a portrait of his late father, the 8th Duke of Ashford, a man who had taught him that titles brought loneliness long before they brought respect. He straightened his jacket, took a slow breath and walked toward the dining hall, knowing that tonight, whether he chose it or not, the truth would finally step into the light. Candlelight filled the dining hall as guests gathered, their voices low and polite, and Elena stood near the window clutching her folder of illustrations, searching the room for a familiar face among the strangers. Then the doors opened, and every head turned, every voice hushed, as Nathaniel walked in wearing a tailored suit, his posture different, his bearing commanding in a way she had never seen in the gardens. The estate's manager stepped forward and announced him formally, calling him by a name and title Elena had never heard him use, His Grace, the 9th Duke of Ashford. The folder slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the polished floor. For a moment the room seemed to tilt around her. Every quiet detail she had dismissed, the staff's careful glances, his uncanny knowledge of every corner of the estate, the sudden extension of her contract, rushed back with painful clarity. She had not fallen for a gardener at all. She had fallen for a lie he allowed to grow day after day without ever correcting her. Guests whispered around her, but she barely heard them. She gathered her scattered sketches with trembling hands and walked quickly from the hall, ignoring the voice calling her name behind her. Nathaniel followed her into the corridor, his formal composure cracking the moment they were alone. "Alina, please let me explain," he said, reaching for her arm. She pulled away, anger and hurt mixing in her voice. "You let me believe you were just a gardener. You let me tell you things I've never told anyone. Was any of it real, or was I simply entertaining you?" "It was real," he said firmly. "All of it. I never lied to you with words. I just couldn't bring myself to end something that finally felt honest." "Honest?" she repeated, disbelief sharpening her tone. "You hid an entire life from me. A title, a fortune, an entire world I knew nothing about." He tried to explain, his voice quieter now, admitting that for years people had only wanted his name, his money, his position, and that being seen simply as Nathaniel, without any of it, had felt like the first honest connection he had known in years. He said he was afraid that revealing the truth sooner would change the way she looked at him, would turn their easy friendship into something guarded and unequal. Alina listened, torn between the hurt of being deceived and the ache of understanding his fear. But the wound was still too fresh, the shock still too raw. She told him she needed time, needed distance, and that night she packed her belongings and left Ashford Hall before sunrise, her sketches finished, her heart anything but settled. 3 weeks passed, and Alina tried to bury herself in new work, but every sketch reminded her of rose gardens and rainstorms, and a man whose laughter had once felt like the safest sound in the world. She told herself the anger would fade with time, yet beneath it lingered a quieter ache, the memory of how genuinely he had listened, how real their friendship had felt before a single formal announcement shattered it. One gray afternoon, a knock sounded at her studio door. She opened it expecting a delivery and instead found Nathaniel standing on the step, dressed not in tailored suits but in the same worn work clothes he had worn the day they met, soil still faintly staining his sleeves. He held no title in his voice this time, only quiet honesty. "I'm not here as a duke," he said. "I'm here as the man who should have told you the truth the very first day, and I'm sorry it took losing you to understand that." Alina crossed her arms, guarded but listening. He told her everything then, the loneliness of growing up beneath a title, the exhausting weight of being valued only for his name, and how her presence in the garden had given him something he thought he would never feel again, a connection built on nothing but honesty and simple companionship. He admitted his silence had been selfish, born from fear rather than malice, and that he understood if she could never forgive the deception. She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the calm sincerity she remembered from their first meeting in the rain. Slowly, the tightness in her chest began to loosen. She had missed him, more than she wanted to admit, and standing before her now was not a duke hiding behind a title, but a man willing to strip away every advantage he had simply to earn back her trust. "You should have told me sooner," she said quietly. "I know," he answered. "I won't make that mistake again." She invited him inside and they talked for hours, not about titles or estates, but about small things, favorite flowers, childhood memories, the quiet dreams they had never shared with anyone else. It was not a sudden fix, not a perfect ending stitched together in a single afternoon, but it was a beginning built on honesty this time, without hidden names or unspoken truths. In the months that followed, Alina returned to Ashford Hall, not as a hired illustrator chasing a deadline, but as herself, walking freely through gardens she now understood completely. Nathaniel walked beside her, no longer hiding behind roses or borrowed titles, simply present, simply honest, and for the first time in years, entirely at peace with being known.